let's get started. Everyone, my name is Sean, as Dave had said. I'm one of the leaders here, but we've been going through the series titled Heroes of Faith, and we are entering what you could call the home stretch, or baseball, rounding second, and we're looking to home. And if we're in a plane, a pilot will be saying, "Attention all passengers, we will be landing soon. The end is in sight." The series is all but finished, and we are on the 1 yard line, just about there. And let's see. If we could be spelling out heroes, if we had a piece of paper and I'd spell out heroes of faith in glue, and Dave would be coming next week to put the glitter on to shake it off, and it would, no, I wasn't sure how that one would go over. Okay, how about this one? If this series were a banana, and it had a little bit of green on it, we'd have to put it back in the brown paper bag for 7 more days. That's a banana hack. For anybody who doesn't know, that's how you get bananas to turn yellow fast. Just put them in a bag. Never mind. That didn't go over well either. Okay, how about this? Okay, how about Elvis is putting on his shoes and looking for his car keys? No? Okay. One more. There's one more. We'll try this one. Okay, how about this? If the series was a banana split, I'm going to stick with this one. This will be it, I promise. If this series was a banana split, the whipped cream's on, I'm sprinkling on some nuts. Dave will be coming next week, put the cherry on top, okay? All right, we'll stick with that one. Okay, so as I said, for several weeks now, we'll be using Hebrews 11 as our roadmap to find the people for our series titled Heroes of Faith. And then we've been looking back at the Old Testament to read the stories of those people listed and see what faith looked like in their lives. And reading from the Aramaic Bible, as I'm sure most of you do regularly, in plain English, it reads, "Now faith is the conviction concerning those things that are in hope, as if it were these things in action and the revelation of those things that are unseen." And depending upon how your mind works, that might not be too plain. So we can look at the NHEB, and it plainly states, "Now faith is being confident of what we hope for, convinced about things we do not see." And ESV throws the word assurance in there. And I'm not real sure how to say it so it's completely understood, but plain old hope is crossing your fingers and maybe even closing your eyes and hoping real hard and sitting back and waiting to see if it happens. But that the hope that was referred to in Psalm 39:7 reads, "And so, Lord, where do I put my hope? My hope is only in you." And that hope comes to life with no need to wish really hard or slowly open your eyes to see if it happens. That hope is, when it becomes alive, that hope is when it's alive, it becomes faith. And then it is lived out regardless of what's going on around us. And we've had the opportunity to read and hear about various people who believed that by a God they were created, and they had a purpose outside of themselves and beyond what they saw around them. And that faith lived out was living a life not for here, but for there. And starting out, we got to hear about Abel and Enoch. And Enoch was the first person who had a missing persons report filed out for him. And then we had Noah and his story being more than just sunshine, rainbows, and smiling animals. And then Abraham and the promises that he rode through life, one of which we can find in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, where we can read that he's told to pack up his stuff and move to a land that we know that he'll never get to. And in that land, his family will take root and grow really tall through his family tree. And all the world will be blessed through his family and given a hope to be lived out as faith. And that blessing is who we know as Jesus. So even though Abraham didn't fully understand the promises that he was to believe, he did believe that he was created by a God and that he should live purposely for him. And we got to hear about his faith eventually turning back into a fingers crossed hope a little after he was told by God to look to the night sky, and as numerous as the stars are, that's how big his family was going to be. And he he and his wife were rather old. And in Hebrews, it says that he was as good as dead. And that's how old he was. And they didn't have any kids yet, so he thought he could help God out a little bit in his plan. So he convinced himself that he could devise this plan. And then he talked to his wife and convinced her also. They had servants. And he was convinced that since God wasn't helping them out, he could help God along by impregnating one of his servants. And it didn't go very well. Because apparently he thought it was his wife's fault, so that's why he went and found someone else. But God saw it differently. God eventually, even though through their indiscretions, through his indiscretions, he and his wife, worked things out, and eventually, they stayed together, and they were blessed with a child by God, not by Abraham trying to take control of the situation. And Abraham lived a while longer, and in faith, he never got to see the land as he was promised, and all the stars, or that blessing that he was told about, and then he died. But I guess one really cool thing in a nerdy Bible sort of way is if you take some of the ways Abraham's faith was tested, and then also some of the other stories you can read about, and if you zoomed out and you took those two and you put them over top, some of the stories in the Old Testament and some of the stories later in the New Testament, they kind of line up. Like there's a foretelling of Jesus in the Old Testament, and then we can see that in the New Testament. And there's a saying that it says throughout the Old Testament, it reads that the Bible in the Old Testament is hope concealed, and that would be Jesus, and in the New Testament is hope revealed. And throughout the Old Testament, we can see God's promise of an eternity with him and how that promise will be kept to eventually us through the life and death of Jesus. And in this series, we also got to hear about others. We got to hear about Isaac and Jacob, and one of the most well-dressed master lemonade makers, Joseph, not Jesus' dad. And then there was Moses, who through divine coincidence, not birth, became the grandson of Pharaoh, the man who harshly enslaved Moses' birth family and their tribe. And he could have sat back and he could have wrote out royalty, but he chose through faith not only to step into Pharaoh's wrath, but convince and lead his people or his tribe out of Egypt toward a land promised to their 430 years worth of great-great-great-great-grandfathers, Abraham. And he personally had to deal with their continual whining, their complaining, their betrayal, their disbelief in God and his promise. But he held fast to God and what was asked of him. And also, out of that, we are told about the sea splitting, manna from heaven, burning bushes, the 10 Commandments. And he died just the same as Abraham did, never seeing the promise fulfilled. And then we got to hear about the land of Jericho and the promise to Abraham about going into a promised land. So we have everybody coming up now. The promised land is on the other side of this wall. And so they all get to this wall, as we were told about, and it was not by human will or force that they went through the wall. It was by faith in what God told them to do that brought down the walls. And part of that story we're given Rahab, who is introduced to us as Rahab the prostitute. Personally, she stands out as one of the most unlikely characters to me in all the ones that we read up to that point. And because from a religious or a biblical standpoint, she wasn't a Jew or even distantly related to one. So why should she care, or why did she have faith? And she ran a hotel, and through what was done to her or what was said to her in life, or whatever circumstances happened to her, she sadly felt the need to sell her body to be used for sex in return for money. And all while doing this, she had heard of the Jews and believed that their God is who he said he is and would do what he said he would do. And she showed great faith in that. And her, with her past, eventually becomes part of the genealogy or the family tree that Abraham was promised and that eventually gives us Jesus. And then we got to hear about Samson, the long-haired, lion carcass, honey-eaten, donkey jaw, bone-wielding party boy who for his final show of faith brings down the house, literally. And we got to hear about David the shepherd, rock chucker, musician, songwriter, runner, leader, roof-looking creeper, slick-talking, bad friend to a loyal soldier, and impregnator of that same loyal soldier's wife and eventual killer of that said loyal soldier friend. And then with that chapter 11, from which we're getting these heroes of faith nearing its end, it stops to give us names and begins to rattle off this huge list of life circumstances that the people who are being addressed in Hebrews would be familiar with, in which we got to hear about Esther, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the first fire walkers, in their faith-filled moment in life. And finally, last week, Dave told us about Elijah. And all of those circumstances had a face to them. And those faces were of people holding on to the promises made by the God of the universe, the God who promised Abraham. And the chapter ends reading this. In Hebrews 11:39 through 40, it reads, "All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us." And with all these stories, we need to remember that it has nothing to do with the individual people and their personal accomplishments. These faces could all be swapped in the face swapping filters. As funny as they may look, it has nothing to do with the people, and it has to do with the faith, and the faith would look the same regardless of their faces. And it's the faith through belief that God has a purpose and a promise, and he will fulfill that promise. And they took the opportunity to live through faith. Some heard from God, others just heard of accounts of God's faithfulness to fulfill his promise. And despite their lives and the choices that they made, even though many chose their way at times, fully aware of what a faithful person looks like or should want to look like. And Hebrews 11:6 reads, "And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists, and he rewards those who sincerely seek him." And it's difficult at times, but we have to remember it's not about our do's and our don'ts. Because we have 430 years to look at from when God spoke to Abraham till when Moses came and the laws came. So we have 430 years of what it looks like to live a faith-filled life without do's and don'ts. And their lives are what we can imagine having a perfect father and loving him and wanting to please him out of respect look like. Because we all know that the following written rules, it doesn't really work out. Because if you don't respect the authority that gives you the rules, and you don't respect the rules that are in place and what they're there for, they'll eventually create resentment in our lives, and we break them out of spite. And then eventually breaking them becomes part of our nature. And we can read about that and what that looks like with the Jews who really didn't love the God that loved them. And we grow in our faith, and as we grow in our faith, our do's and wants will change. So don't abandon your faith, and don't let it become a fingers crossed hope when it doesn't seem to be working out or things aren't going exactly how you pictured them. The stories in the lives of the people and the heroes of faith that we've been talking about, they're all condensed. And some of them, it was several years between things. And some of them, it was even decades. And before they saw any evidence of God's promises in their lives. And you guys have, several things you're up against, and there's just a few of them. You have parental abandonment, by either your moms or your dads, or your mom and you don't have a dad, or you have dads and you don't have moms, or some of you don't have a mom or a dad, and they're not physically there. And if they are there, they've mentally checked out. There's no one there for you to go to when you run into stuff, or whenever you come up against stressors in life. There's no place for you to go to. There's no one to look to try to understand how to navigate through these things in life. I mean, you're faced with you have these false sense of what your life should look like in all forms of media coming at you, and so in knowing that, you guys, in this time in your life, you're given the perfect opportunity to look outside of yourselves, to look to something bigger, to get a bigger picture to your life than what's going on around you. And you're going to go through times in life where, your do's, your don'ts outnumber your do's, and there is grace and faith. And it's not a slap on your hand that, like, you guys shouldn't have done that. And it's an okay. Here's where you went wrong, and here's how you can avoid that outcome. And in 10:27 of Luke, it reads, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And if you do that, all those other written rules, they'll all fall into place. But it's out of love that we do it, and it's out of love that there is patience for us, and whenever we fall short. And there's a song, I wasn't sure how this would go over. There's a song some of you may be familiar with. We're going on a bear hunt. Anybody? We're going on a bear hunt? We're going to catch a big one? And you come into tall grass, you can't go through it, you can't go, and nobody? Just a couple? Anybody? Okay. No, nobody wants to sing along? No, sing along. I figured, I was hoping someone would sing along, but okay. Anyhow, what the story is, okay, you have this kid's song. For those of you that don't know, they're going on a bear hunt and they're trying to find a bear. And they come up to grass and they can't go through it. They can't go? Can't go through it. They'll have to go, can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it. You'll have to go through it. Okay, so you kind of get where this is going to go. And what that song is teaching us is that in life, we're going to face obstacles, okay? And just like the heroes of faith, they weren't able to go over it, they weren't able to go around it, they weren't able to go under it, they had to go through it. And the only way to do that is because they had a bigger picture to it all and a promise to hold on to, helping them through it. All right? So I'm going to add a few more nuts to this series by looking at the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament was hope through faith and a promise. And the New Testament was first hope through faith, and then it was a sight-driven faith, okay? And for those of the New Testament, for those who don't know, the New Testament is personal accounts from people who had their everyday ho-hum lives disrupted by a guy, Jesus, who said simply, "Hey, I need you to help me with something. Come follow me." All right? That's simply putting it, but you get the picture of what's going on here. And this guy said and did all sorts of things out of the ordinary, but not right at first when he was doing all this other stuff. But eventually, he told his guys that he asked to follow him. Eventually, he told them that he was the Son of God, and then through him, a better way to life was available. And the guys that he was following, they felt as they were being oppressed by the Romans at the time, and they thought it was about their here and now. Like, oh, Jesus is coming to help us. He's going to be our king. He's going to be a ruler and get it through it all. And it wasn't about that at all. It was actually about their eternity, which they later found out. And in just 3 short years of having these guys follow him around, now, you got to think about that for a second. Of every single church in this world, every single Christian in this world, every single follower, all this came from 3 short years in a man's life. 3 years produced all of this. We're here today because of 3 years of a man's life. I just lost my years. How long ago that was? 1200? Somebody help me out. How long ago was Jesus here? 2,000 years ago. Okay, so 3 years, 2,000 years ago. Thank you very much. 3 years, 2,000 years ago. We're living it out right now. Okay. So I want to get back to that. Okay, so just in 3 years, this guy Jesus had a ton of people who heard about him, followed him, and celebrated his arrival in their towns. And this scared and angered. I'm just telling you about what the New Testament is about. For those who don't know. And this scared and angered local authorities and the religious authorities, and so they killed him. And only a few of his closest friends and family stuck around to care for his dead body. And lo and behold, this guy's body was gone from his grave. Side note, from what I understand in those days, I wondered why they put bodies in, but what they used to do is they used to take bodies and they put them in these caves until all that rotted, and then they'd take the bones and they'd put them someplace else. That's just side note, that's just how they took care of their dead bodies like we do it now. Anyhow, I get sidetracked sometimes. Now I can't find where I was. Okay. Okay. Okay, the New Testament. So they get back to the grave, and his body is gone. Okay, and oh my goodness gracious! Okay, his body was gone, and he shows back up at first only to his close friends, and then eventually to a couple hundred people. And he tells his friends, now that I've done what I said I would do by coming back from the dead, his close buddies who were Jews, they now understood what they read about and had read to them over and over and over and again and again and again by their parents and their pastors. And so remember how earlier I said in the Old Testament, God is concealed, and the New, God is revealed. Well, now everything that Jesus was talking to them about, talking to his friends about for 3 years, traveling around with them, all made sense. And he tells them that I am who I said I am because I did what I said I'd do. Now go tell the world about it and promise. Go tell the world about it and the promise that can be made to any who believe. And so his close buddies did this, and we can read about what happened in their lives with Jesus when they were traveling around, and why they would all believe for certain. So those are their testimonies, and some were even brutally killed for telling about it and living for Jesus. And so some of his friends were, so we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 testimonies. So what those are testimonies of those men's lives spending time with Jesus. And this is why they would eventually die for the faith that they had, that Jesus was God come to earth. All right? And there's also his close friend Peter, the guy who acts before he thinks, and we can also read about his life accounts, and James, Jesus' brother, and the youngest friend, follower, believer, John. The other letters are written by a latecomer, Paul. And just another side note, there's verifiable proof outside of the Bible from people who aren't Christians that there was a man named Jesus who did way out of the ordinary things and was killed for doing so and for saying what he said. So with that being true, at some point in your life, if you haven't already, you'll need to consider some of the truths that you get to hear. So some of his followers, as I mentioned, were brutally killed and still held on to, and would not even deny in word that Jesus was who he said he was, and followed his instructions out of faith. I mean, think about this. Try to start a big lie with anybody, with people Try to start a lie and have people die. Like, you'd have to pick a couple good friends to tell, and they have to hold on to this lie for you, and they're going to die for it. They're going to be tortured for it, and they're still going to hold on to your lie even after you're killed for it. Do any of you have friends like that? Would you be a friend like that? Would you die for someone else's lie? Holding on to it, would you be tortured? Would you do those things? I probably wouldn't. So we're going to look at James, Jesus' brother. And those who have brothers and sisters, what would your brother or sister have to do to make you believe that they're God? And then be persecuted, just like the lie your friends are going to tell you. What would your brother have to tell you? What would he have to do for you to believe that he is God? And you get thrown off a building and beaten and bludgeoned to death, saying that, yes, my brother is God. Do any of you have brothers or sisters like that? Would you do that? Would you believe them? What would it take for you to believe that? And then we have Peter, who's one of the writers in the New Testament. He was crucified the same as Jesus, and we're told that it was upside down. And through all this persecution and torture leading up to his execution, he never wavered from faith in Jesus. And then there's Paul. He first was a super Jew. He was first a super Jew who had believers in Jesus the Christ hunted down and killed. And then Jesus appeared to him and told him to stop and believe that he is who he said he is, and he is who he was told about in the Old Testament. And he needs to turn from and rethink his ways and tell people about Jesus and his life and death and resurrection. And he was beaten, he was stoned, and he was thrown into prison several times, never wavering from the truth and task given to him by God. And he even wrote letters to churches telling of his persecution and how because of that truth and that task that he was given, that he was able to go on a bear hunt himself. And for my last example, there's John, the infamous John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. That John, from what I can find, he was in his mid-teens whenever Jesus asked him to follow him. And he was the last man standing out of the whole original group. And he was prosecuted and punished many times, and he wouldn't stop talking about it so much that in one account it says that he was even boiled in oil, and he still wouldn't shut up. So the political authorities got so sick of him, they shipped him off to a remote island with an extremely limited audience. And there he lived in a cave, and he wrote the last book that we can find in our Bible. So if those guys, you need to consider this, if those guys were willing to die for Jesus, there's got to be a reason why. I mean, you may want to rethink or repent. All that means is just to turn from. Rethink what's going on in your life, or turn from what's going on in your life. You need to rethink your reason or your purpose for living, because it's not about here on earth. It's about there in eternity. And that same faith that all of those that I've mentioned had is available to you by simply believing that he is who he says he is, he did what he said he did, and that he is God and has provided you a way to live in eternity with him by believing in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And belief in him will change your wanter. I heard that on a podcast recently, and I appreciated that term. So one of the maps, I think it's the last one, is probably, I think it's will change or repent from wanting what we want to wanting what he wants for us. So how about this? I was trying to think of an illustration about Jesus in your life after putting trust in him. And I think I came up with something maybe some of you can relate to, is driver's education. Jesus, he'll be your teacher both in the classroom and on the road. And I guess that's where Carrie Underwood, Jesus Take the Wheel song came from. I was going to sing it, but I'm not. I don't think it'd work out real well. But anyhow, in an eternity, depending on our do's and don'ts and our own skills that we've gathered through life, that'd be like showing up to get your driver's license, and the first time you mess up, the first time you do anything wrong, it's fail. You do not get your license. But you have a chance to have a teacher to show you examples of do this and do that, and here's the result. Don't do this, don't do that, because eventually this could be the result. And he's always there with us in our head, and okay, and like here's what happens when you do this, and here's what happens when you do that, and here's how you should react whenever these things happen in your life. And eventually it becomes second nature. And yes, we're going to get it wrong from time to time, but it's not a pass-fail. And it's not, I don't know, if you think about faith, it's just a belief. It's a hope. And you have all these guys and girls that demonstrated what faith looks like in their lives. And some of us will never get to have things done or get to do things that are going to get written down or told about. But we can go through our everyday lives knowing that there's something bigger than us, something outside of us, something to live for besides this world. And for anyone at any time, now or later, or even much later, we can rest once we believe in a promise that we can read about in Galatians 3:29, where it reads, "And now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs. God's promise to Abraham belongs to you."